I'm Stephen, and this is the fourth and final video about converting my Dodge weapons carrier from a flying control vehicle back into a normal Dodge, following its repaint at the end of 2021. It's below freezing temperature here in the garage, so I'm going to take the rest of the video indoors and do it there. I left the story in mid-October in 2021, when the Dodge repaint was complete. It now looked like a standard Dodge weapons carrier again, but I couldn't leave it like that, it was just too ordinary. In my old garage, I'd fitted a steel beam in the ceiling for a dolly and chain hoist. I used it when I was rebuilding the Ford Jeep. I may still end up fitting it into the new garage, but wondered whether I could use any of the steel work to build a crane in the back of the Dodge instead. At a number of shows, I've seen various types of crane fitted to trucks, such as that seen on the Chevy bomb truck and a number 7 set crane on a GMC truck. Those were factory built, but I'd also seen wartime pictures of field built cranes, particularly on air bases. My first thought was to use the steel beams that I'd removed from the old garage. I could make a crane along the lines of a number 7 set crane with the dolly and chain hoist fitted. The rear of the beam and the diagonal support braces would need to be removable so that it would fit into the garage. I had two pieces of steel work that could be used. The longer one had a slightly smaller section and would be easier to cut and work with. This is the dolly from the old garage. It could run along the beam and allow me to lift a load such as a Jeep engine and then bring it into the back of the Dodge for transport. The chain hoist would hang from the dolly and provide easy lifting. There were two problems: the weight and size of the crane itself. The beam would be a large amount of weight to secure safely in the back of the Dodge, and if I needed it out for any reason, it was going to be a large and heavy object to move and then store. After some further searching of the internet for ideas, I drew up a much lighter and more practical design. This would use an A-frame designed jib for the crane, with a cable winch mounted in the truck to raise and lower the jib. The chain hoist would then be mounted on the end of the A-frame to do the lifting. A heavy object like a Jeep engine could be lifted and the jib raised to bring the engine over the bed of the Dodge, where it then could be lowered again. The two bars of the A-frame would be much lighter and far easier to de-rig and stow if not needed. After a few calculations on the materials I needed, I placed an order for the steel work and also found a winch which was then painted olive drab ready for fitting when needed. All of the steel work was cut to size by the supplier, so I only needed to do the final trimming and shaping in order to weld it together. These are the main pieces laid out on the workshop floor to get an idea of the size. Before I could go any further, I needed to rework the inside of the truck bed. The child seat support frame was removed first, followed by the false floor. The frame would be refitted so I could still make use of the child seat, but it would now be fitted at floor level. This frame would also provide the mounting point for the winch. Some of the original floor frame was removed and a new triangle structure was welded up at the front to hold the winch. This gave the handle enough clearance to miss the floor and the front of the body as it was rotated. The winch cable used to raise and lower the crane was just clear of the side of the child seat, and the seat itself would now be a more permanent fitting, although still removable if needed. I had 2 1/4-inch thick steel plates to make the head of the crane. This is what the chain hoist would hang from. They were marked out with tape and the holes centre punched ready for drilling. The chain hoist was painted olive drab and left to one side to dry while I worked on the crane head. The 2 plates were drilled for 2 bolts that would hold them together to allow me to work on both pieces as a matching pair. Then the 2 larger holes were cut by chain drilling a series of holes where I wanted the large holes to be. These holes were for the chain hoist and for the shackle that the winch would connect to. After the holes were chain drilled, the plates were then separated, and the drill was used to break out the small webs between the holes until the waste pieces could be removed. The plates were then bolted back together and I started to clean up the large hole with a half-round file. It took a lot of filing to clean up the edges. The file was too big for the small hole, but I had a conical grinding stone that was just the right size. With the stone in the pillar drill and a bit of oil for lubrication, the stone was gradually worked through the 1/2-inch thick steel plates. Once the holes were done, the 2 plates were cut to the final shape and the corners rounded off. This is the approximate position of the crane head, shown with the top shackle fitted. The end of the A-frame bar would need tapering before the head could be fitted. For the next stage, I needed to turn the Dodge around. After the Remembrance Day events, I parked the Dodge in the garage facing outwards. Now I needed the back of the Dodge next to the door so the crane could be assembled out through the opening. Once the Dodge was turned around, I was able to lay out the bars in the back to work out where their position would be. This then allowed me to extend the floor frame to the point where I wanted the A-frame mounting points to be. The floor frame was bolted to the floor at this point, and the 1/4" mounting plates jigged up for welding. The lower ends of the bars were slotted with an angle grinder to allow the pivot plate to be welded in. Once the lower end of the bars could be fitted into their mounts, the upper ends were brought together to work out the angle they needed to be cut at for the crane head. With those cut, there was a little final trimming to do until they were a good match and would come together with minimal gaps. The two pieces of the crane head were bolted together and jigged up between the two bars with G-clamps. I used some copper wire wrapped around the two bars and wound up to tension the bars against the crane head. Once the head was welded to the bars, I was able to rig the crane for the first time. At this point, the winch cable was connected directly to the crane head. It was a 1,200-pound cable. When I bought the Dodge back in 2010, there was a hook and pulley block in one of the lockers. If I rigged up the pulley block to the winch, it would effectively gear the winch to allow the crane to carry the same weight for less load on the winch. So after a break for lunch, I returned to the Dodge and re-rigged the crane with the pulley. It felt better and looked more technical, which I liked. I wanted to be able to drive with the crane rigged and planned to connect the chain hoist hook to the Dodge tow hook. The chain hoist operating chains still needed to be kept out of the way. To keep them out of the way, I welded 3 hooks along the length of the right-hand side bar. The chains could be wrapped around the hooks with the excess laying in the back of the truck. So, did it work? I tied an old ratchet strap around the chain hoist hook and climbed on. Well, there you go, at least it can support 13 and a bit stone. After that test, the crane was de-rigged and the floor frame was removed. Some of the welded joints couldn't be fully welded while it was fitted into the truck, so with the frame out it was inverted and the remaining welds could be finished. The floor frame was taken to the workshop for final finishing. The pivot bolts for the A-frame were made from hardened steel roll bolts, with a cranking handle welded to the end. This would allow them to quickly screw in or out to allow me to remove the crane. The A-frame bars were then cleaned up and primed, and the following day the other side was primed. The day after that, the bars received the first coat of olive drab paint. The floor frame had a loop welded so the winch cable could be secured when the crane wasn't rigged. The existing paint was rubbed down, new metal was primed, and then the whole rig got its first coat of olive drab. To avoid confusion when I was using the chain hoist, it was stenciled with up and down so I'd know which chains to pull to raise and lower the load. Once the paint on the crane was dry, it was rigged up again and some plywood blocks were epoxied to the bars where they rest on the tailgate of the Dodge. They were left in place until the glue had set. It was all de-rigged once more and the bars were brought back into the workshop so I could fit some self-tapping screws through the wood to strengthen the joint. After that, the wooden pads were painted. Since the Dodge wouldn't fit in the garage with the crane attached, I needed to be able to store the crane parts in the truck. I cut some wooden supports to hold the bars. Once I was happy the bars weren't banging off each other or the truck, the excess material was cut away. They were then painted and left to dry. They were finally ready for fitting on Christmas morning, so after the present opening and before the in-laws arrived for lunch, the supports were screwed to the locker lids. For the next few days there was quite a lot of rain, but finally on December the 30th it dried up enough for a drive out. The Dodge was brought out of the garage, the canvas fitted and the crane rigged. This was the first time I'd seen the Dodge complete with the crane and outdoors. I really liked the look of it with the crane fitted. The size looked in proportion to the truck and the whole appearance looked balanced. The Jeep was also brought out to join in with the photo shoot. I planned a 14-mile local drive, stopping at a number of spots along the route for some pictures. Andy, one of our local gang, came along to join in with the photo shoot. The first stop was with the Jeep close up behind, to size up the crane against the height and position of the Jeep engine. I took some ammo boxes along for pictures too. Eventually I want to make a full-size fiberglass B-17 propeller to hang from the crane at the events. I may also look for an old Jeep engine to build a replica engine crate for another display item. I'm going to finish this video with some pictures and video from the photo shoot day.
dried round.